The morning Arthur Garrett rode into Dust Creek, New Mexico territory, with a job he did not want and a conscience that would not let him refuse it. The sun was already punishing the earth like it had a personal grudge, and the woman standing outside the land office looked like she was prepared to fight the whole territory with nothing but a ledger book and sheer determination. He had been warned about her. His employer, a railroad man named Horace Dunmore, had used words like difficult and stubborn and unreasonable, and Arthur had nodded along politely because that was what you did when the man paying your wages spoke. He had done bodyguard work before. He had escorted bank representatives through Apache country, ridden shotgun on gold transfers, and once spent 3 weeks protecting a federal judge who had the survival instincts of a man who had never once considered that the world could be dangerous. He knew how to keep his distance, do his job, and walk away clean when it was finished. What Horace Dunmore had neglected to mention was that Sallie Bancroft was 26 years old with dark auburn hair pinned up in a way that suggested it would rather be down, sharp green eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and the kind of composure under pressure that most seasoned men could not manage. She was standing outside the land office in the dust and the heat, arguing with 2 men who were twice her size and clearly used to getting what they wanted, and she was winning. Arthur pulled his horse up at the hitching post and sat there for a moment, watching. "The deed is registered in my father's name, and as his sole heir it transfers to me," she was saying, her voice calm and precise as a lawyer's closing argument. "I have the papers. I have the signatures witnessed and notarized in Santa Fe. If you dispute that, gentlemen, I suggest you take it to the territorial court in Las Cruces, where I will meet you and bring my attorney, and we will see exactly how that conversation ends." The 2 men exchanged a look. One of them, a broad-shouldered fellow in a brown duster with a badge pinned crooked on his lapel, took a step toward her. Not a threatening step exactly, but close enough to it that Arthur swung down from his horse. He did not have to say anything. He walked up and stood slightly behind and to the left of Sallie Bancroft, which was where a man stood when he was making a point, and he let his size do the talking. He was not a small man. Years of hard work and harder living had built him broad through the shoulders, with hands that told their own story. He simply stood there and looked at the 2 men with the particular expression that said very clearly that he had no preference either way about how this went. The man with the badge reconsidered his step. "We'll be watching that property," the other man said, as if that were a meaningful threat, and then they walked away. Sallie turned and looked at Arthur. She looked at him the way she had looked at those 2 men, which was to say directly and without flinching, taking inventory of exactly who and what she was dealing with. "You must be the man Dunmore sent," she said. "Arthur Garrett," he said. "I didn't ask for a bodyguard." "No, ma'am, you didn't. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "I saw that," he said, and he meant it genuinely, not sarcastically, which seemed to surprise her. She studied him for another moment. "Well," she said finally, "since Dunmore has apparently decided that sending someone was necessary regardless of my preferences, I suppose I cannot stop you following me around. But I want to be clear about something, Mr. Garrett. I am not a package to be delivered. I am not a fragile thing to be kept behind glass. If you work with me, that is the arrangement. You work with me. Not around me, not ahead of me, not instead of me." "Understood," Arthur said. She nodded once as if that settled it, picked up the leather satchel at her feet and walked toward the street. Arthur untied his horse, gathered the reins, and followed. He had told himself riding in that morning that this would be a simple job. Watch the woman, keep her safe, collect his wages, and go. He had done it before. He had made a point of never getting personally invested. That was how you stayed professional. That was how you stayed alive, in a manner of speaking. He had been telling himself a great many things, he would come to realize, that had very little bearing on how the next several weeks would actually unfold. Dust Creek was a town of about 400 people in the year 1882. sitting in the high desert of New Mexico territory at the base of a ridge of red rock hills that turned purple at dusk. It had been a mining supply town that had outgrown its origins and was now something more complicated, with a main street of permanent buildings mixed in among the older shanty structures, a proper hotel with a dining room, a doctor's office, 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a blacksmith, and the land office where Sallie had been standing when Arthur arrived. The trouble, as Arthur came to understand it over the next 2 days, was rooted in land and money, as most trouble in the territory was. Sallie's father, a man named James Bancroft, had been a rancher in the valley south of town. He had died the previous winter of a fever, leaving behind a modest but well-watered ranch and a daughter who had come all the way from Missouri, where she had been working as a schoolteacher, to claim her inheritance. The railroad wanted right-of-way through the valley. Horace Dunmore, the man who had hired Arthur, represented the railroad's land acquisition office. And there were others, men whose names Arthur gathered slowly, who had been using James Bancroft's death as an opportunity to muddy the waters around the deed and the land boundaries, hoping to claim pieces of it before the daughter arrived to assert her rights. The railroad did not want Sallie harmed. Dunmore had been very clear about that. They wanted her cooperative, or at the very least, not making noise in the territorial press. So Arthur's job was officially described as escort and protection, which was a polite way of saying that the railroad wanted a friendly face close to Sallie Bancroft, while they continued pressing her for an easement she had not agreed to sign. Arthur understood this. He had taken the job with his eyes open, but there was something uncomfortable about it that he did not examine too closely in those first days, the way a man does not press on a bruise when he has work to do. Sallie had been staying at the Dust Creek Hotel, and she had already established a routine that she kept with the kind of disciplined consistency that told Arthur she was doing it deliberately, making herself predictable and visible and present in the community, so that anyone who had thoughts about making her disappear quietly would know that people had noticed her. She was smart, he thought again. She had thought this through. On the second morning, she went to the land office to review survey records, and Arthur sat in the waiting area outside and read a 6-week-old newspaper while she worked inside for 3 hours. On the way back, she stopped at the dry goods store and bought coffee and a tin of crackers and talked to the woman behind the counter for 20 minutes in a way that was clearly not idle conversation. She was building relationships, building a picture of who in this town could be trusted and who could not. That evening, she came down to the hotel dining room for supper and found Arthur already at a table near the wall, which was where he always sat so he could see both doors. She paused, looked at the table, then looked at the empty chair across from him and said, "Is there some reason we should not share a table, or are you going to eat alone every meal staring at me from across the room?" "I'm not staring," he said. "You are watching, which is your job, I know. But it is also slightly unsettling to eat supper while someone observes you the way a hawk watches a field mouse." Despite himself, the corner of his mouth moved. "I could sit outside," he offered. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, and sat down across from him. That was the first evening they actually talked, not about the land or Dunmore or the men at the courthouse, but about things at a slight remove from all of that. She asked him where he was from, and he told her Texas, Blanco County, a place that was long behind him. She told him about Missouri and the school where she had taught, about the 32 students she had in a single room, and how she had loved it so genuinely that leaving had been a real grief, even though she had known she had to come. "Why did you have to come?" he asked. "You could have let an attorney handle the estate." She was quiet for a moment, and he watched something move through her expression that was not quite sadness and not quite determination, but some combination of the two. "Because it was my father's life," she said. "He built that ranch with nothing. He came here in 1861 with a horse and a bedroll and $20, and he built something real. He deserves for it to be defended by someone who loved him, not just by someone who was paid to shuffle papers." Arthur did not have anything to say to that, but he thought about it for a long time after she had said it. The third day brought the first real complication. Sallie had arranged to ride out to the Bancroft ranch to meet with a man named Caleb Hatch, who had been her father's foreman, and was still running the small remaining crew on the property. Arthur saddled his own horse and a mare from the livery for her, and they rode south out of town into the valley as the morning cooled to something almost pleasant. She rode well, he noticed. Not the polished way of someone who had been taught riding as an accomplishment, but the practical, easy way of someone who had grown up spending time in a saddle. Missouri had clearly included real country living at some point, or perhaps she had visited her father over the years, learned from him. "You grew up riding?" he asked, because the silence had been comfortable enough that a question felt natural. "My father taught me when I was a girl," she said. "During summers I'd come stay with him on the ranch. My parents were not married by the time I was old enough to remember. My mother took me to St. Louis, but my father and I wrote letters, and I came every summer until I was 16. She paused. "He was a good man, quiet, straightforward. He always said what he meant." Arthur thought that explained a good deal about her. The ranch was about 7 miles south of town, sitting in a bend of a small creek with a stand of cottonwoods and a long ridge of red rock behind it. There was a main house built of adobe, a barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and a corral with a half-dozen horses. Caleb Hatch was waiting in the yard, a weathered man of about 50 with a white mustache and the honest, tired face of someone who had been worrying for months. The meeting was productive and painful at the same time. Hatch told Sallie in careful, measured language about the men who had been coming around since her father's death, about the fence line that had been cut on the eastern boundary, about the water rights dispute that had appeared out of nowhere, even though the creek had been undisputedly Bancroft water for 20 years. He told her which of the neighboring ranchers were sympathetic and which were not, and he named names with the specificity of a man who had been keeping careful account. Arthur stood back and listened, saying nothing, but he catalogued every name and every detail with the habit of a man who made his living knowing what mattered. On the ride back, Sallie was quieter than she had been. The ease that had settled over her during the morning had given way to something heavier. Arthur rode beside her and did not try to fix it with talk. After a while she said, "The man with the badge, the one outside the land office on the day you arrived. Hatch told me he works for Marcus Lyle." "Who is Marcus Lyle?" Arthur asked, though he had already gathered part of the answer from context. "The largest landowner in the valley aside from my father's holdings. He's been buying up parcels for 2 years. If he gets our water rights, our land becomes worth very little to anyone, including the railroad." She looked sideways at him. "Including Dunmore." Arthur said nothing. "You work for the railroad," she said, not accusatory, just clarifying. "Dunmore hired me," he said. "That's true." Why does a railroad want to protect a woman they're simultaneously trying to pressure into an easement? He thought about how to answer that honestly. "They don't want trouble," he said. "They don't want headlines about a woman being harassed off her inheritance in the New Mexico territory. The papers back east are watching how the railroads conduct themselves out here. Bad press slows the bond sales." "So I'm a liability," she said. "You're a complication," he said. "That's different." She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that was measuring, precise, a bit amused in a way that had no humor in it. "Are you a complication too, Mr. Garrett?" He looked ahead at the road. "Usually," he said. Somewhere around the 4th day of riding out to the ranch in the morning and returning to town by evening, of sharing the hotel dining room table for supper and talking until the kitchen closed, of standing in the hot afternoon sun outside survey offices and deed recorders, while she worked inside and came out with new information every time, Arthur began to be aware of a feeling that he could not quite classify and therefore preferred not to examine. It was not something dramatic. It did not announce itself. It arrived the way weather arrives in high desert, gradually and then all at once, so that when you finally noticed the sky had changed, You understood it had been changing for a while. He noticed the way she tilted her head slightly when she was about to challenge an assumption, the minute gesture that preceded the precise, careful dismantling of whatever position you thought you had held. He noticed the way she laughed, not often, but when she did, it was genuine and full and came from somewhere she did not usually let people see. He noticed that she always folded her napkin the same way at the end of a meal, with the precise habit of someone who had spent years in a household where small orderliness was how you asserted dignity in difficult circumstances. He noticed that when she was anxious, which was less often than the situation probably warranted, she straightened things. The papers in her satchel, the items on the dining table, the position of her coffee cup. She did it without seeming to realize she was doing it. He noticed these things and told himself he was simply doing his job. A good protective escort read the person he was protecting, understood their patterns. It was professional observation. He was lying to himself, and he knew it, and he kept doing it anyway because the alternative was inconvenient. By the end of the first week, Marcus Lyle made a more direct appearance. He came to the hotel on a Tuesday afternoon, and he was not what Arthur had pictured. He was a man of about 50, well-dressed by Dust Creek standards, with a measured manner that spoke of someone who understood the value of appearing reasonable. He asked the hotel desk to send a message to Miss Bancroft requesting a meeting in the dining room, which was a public space, at 4 o'clock. Sallie told Arthur about this as she was preparing to go down. "I want you in the room," she said, "but not involved. I can handle this conversation." "I know you can," he said. She paused in the act of pinning her hair back with a focus that suggested the precision of it was not about vanity, but about presenting herself exactly as she wished to be seen. "You believe that," she said, sounding slightly surprised. "I've watched you handle 5 conversations this week that most men I know would have fumbled." She looked at him in the mirror above the small washstand, their eyes meeting in reflection. Something shifted in the quality of the silence. He looked away first, which was unusual for him. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was a little quieter than it had been. "That is not something I hear often." The meeting with Marcus Lyle was instructive. He was smooth and practiced, and laid out an offer for the eastern parcel of the Bancroft land, which was the piece with the disputed fence line, and he framed it as generosity and neighborly goodwill. He did not mention the water rights directly. He did not mention the fence that had been cut. He was polished enough that someone without all of Hatch's information would have found him very difficult to argue with. Sallie listened to every word. She thanked him for his time. She said she would think carefully about any offer. She neither accepted nor rejected anything. And when he was gone, Arthur sat down across from her and she said without preamble, "He wants that parcel because if he has it, he controls the approach to the creek from the eastern side. With the fence already cut and the boundary in dispute, he was hoping I'd take the offer without understanding what I was actually selling." "Did you already know this before the meeting?" Arthur asked. "I suspected it. The meeting confirmed it." She folded her hands on the table with the deliberate composure of someone filing something away. "He will not get it." Arthur looked at her and felt the feeling that he was not naming do something uncomfortable in his chest. "No," he agreed. "He won't." 2 days after the Lyle meeting, something happened that shifted the comfortable arrangement of professional distance that Arthur had been maintaining with considerable effort. He and Sallie had ridden out to the ranch for what had become their established morning review with Hatch. The afternoon was drawing in with unusual cloud cover, rare and welcome in the heat, when one of the horses in the south pasture threw a shoe, and Hatch's remaining ranch hand, a boy of about 16, managed to spook the animal badly enough in the process of catching it that the horse came through the corral fence and took off at a dead run toward the creek. Arthur went after it because it was the sensible response and because he was on a horse that could run. He caught the animal near the cottonwoods, got a rope on it, and walked it back to find Sallie already in the corral with Hatch. inspecting the fence damage and talking to the boy with the kind of measured patience that made it clear she was not going to make him feel worse than he already felt about the accident. The horse had a cut above the knee from the fence. Not deep, but it needed attention, and Arthur had supplies in his saddlebag that he'd learned over years of riding to keep. He cleaned and wrapped the wound while Sallie held the horse's head and talked to it quietly, and at some point during this process, she was standing close enough that her arm was almost against his shoulder, and he could smell soap and the clean scent of her hair, and none of this was anything he had any business noticing. He focused on the bandage. He tied it carefully. He stood up and put distance between them, and went to put the supplies back in his bag, and absolutely did not think about the 3 inches of space that had existed between them for about 4 minutes. That evening, he sat on the porch of the hotel after supper while she wrote letters inside, and he had a very straightforward conversation with himself that involved honesty and practical reality. The practical reality was that she was the woman he was being paid to protect by people who were working against her interests. Even if he set aside the conflict inherent in his employment, which was already a problem he was going to have to address honestly soon, there was the plain fact that he had a job to finish, wages to earn, and a habit of not complicating professional arrangements with personal feelings. He told himself all of this, and then sat there in the warm night air watching the stars come out over the desert hills and felt, quite distinctly, that reality had decided not to cooperate. The next morning, Sallie came down to breakfast with new information that changed the shape of everything. She had received a letter by the previous evening's mail, which she had apparently been awake half the night reading and rereading, because there were faint shadows under her eyes that had not been there before. She slid the letter across the breakfast table to him without saying anything, which told him she trusted his perspective, which was a separate problem entirely. The letter was from a land attorney in Santa Fe named Price, who had been helping her with the deed filing. It contained the information that someone had filed a competing claim to the western section of the Bancroft land, using a document that dated the claim before James Bancroft's original filing from 1861. Price thought the document was fraudulent. He also thought it was good enough to cause serious legal trouble unless they could prove its fraudulence, which would require the original survey records from the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, and possibly testimony from anyone alive who had been in the valley in 1861 and could attest to the history of the land. Who would know? Arthur asked. Hatch came in 1866. He wouldn't know the first 5 years. Sallie was looking at the letter with focused intensity. But there's a man named Ezra Flood who runs the livery in town. He came to the valley in 1859. My father mentioned him in letters. He would know. Let's go talk to Ezra Flood, Arthur said. Ezra Flood was a thin man of about 65 with enormous hands and a memory like a steel trap, as it turned out. He remembered James Bancroft arriving in 1861. He remembered helping him build the first structure on the land, a small shed that predated the main house by 2 years. He remembered the survey being done in the spring of 1862 by a man from the territorial government. And when Arthur described the competing claim and its claimed date, Ezra Flood shook his head with absolute certainty. Nobody was on that land before Bancroft, he said. I was here. I know everyone who was in this valley before the war, during the war, and after. That claim is a lie. Sallie's composure during this conversation was extraordinary. She thanked Ezra Flood. She asked precise follow-up questions that established every piece of information she would need, and she wrote it all down in a small notebook with neat handwriting. It was only when they stepped back out onto the main street that Arthur, walking beside her, noticed that her hand, holding the notebook, was shaking slightly. Not from fear. He could tell the difference. From the sustained effort of holding everything together at a constant, professional level when what was happening was deeply personal and unfair and exhausting. He stopped walking. She stopped a half step later and turned to look at him. This will hold, he said. looking directly at her. "Ezra Flood is credible. Your paperwork is solid. Price in Santa Fe knows what he's doing. You have the original deed. The fraudulent claim won't stand." She looked at him for a moment. Then she breathed out just once, a single controlled exhale, and the trembling in her hand stilled. "I know," she said. "I know that. I just need to hear it said plainly occasionally." "I'll say it as many times as it's useful," he said, and then felt that the sentence had come out more personally than he had intended, and looked away toward the end of the street where two horses stood tied outside the second saloon. There was a pause. "Arthur," she said, and his first name in her voice felt like the sun coming around a corner. "What exactly is your arrangement with Dunmore?" He had been expecting this question. He had been dreading it with the particular dread of someone who knows they have an answer that is both honest and complicated. "He pays my wages," Arthur said. "He hired me to be your escort and protection. And," he looked back at her, "and to be, in his words, a friendly face. A good relationship," he said, "to help facilitate an agreeable discussion about the easement." Sallie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "In other words, to make me comfortable enough to eventually agree to something I haven't agreed to." "That was the intention," Arthur said. "Yes." Another silence. The main street of Dusk Creek went about its midday business around them, horses and foot traffic, and the sound of a hammer from somewhere near the blacksmith. "And what is your intention?" she asked. Arthur looked at her. He thought about the wages and the job and the careful distance he had been maintaining and the conversation he had with himself on the hotel porch. He thought about the way she had held the horse's head at the ranch while he wrapped the wound, and the way she had talked to the 16-year-old boy without making him feel small. He thought about how she had come all the way from Missouri to defend her father's name and the way she said he was a good man, quiet, straightforward. He always said what he meant. "My intention," he said carefully, "is to keep you safe and help you keep what is yours." She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once, and the nature of that nod was different from her usual decisive ones. It was something quieter. "All right," she said. "Then let's write to Price in Santa Fe." The letter went that afternoon, and the following days settled into a pattern that was outwardly the same as before but different underneath in a way that Arthur felt in every room they shared. She had not withdrawn from him. If anything, the honesty of the conversation on the street had cleared something away, some careful formal structure they had both been maintaining, and what was left was more comfortable and considerably more dangerous. They talked more easily. She told him about her students in Missouri, about a boy named Thomas who had learned to read at age 10 and had cried the first time he read a whole page without stopping. And the way she told it, with that particular warmth that only appeared when she was talking about something that genuinely mattered to her, made Arthur feel things he had no practical use for. He told her about Texas, about his family's farm and the drought that had ended it, about his younger brother who had gone south to work the cattle drives, and the slow drift into protective work that had followed years of not being anchored to any one place. He did not usually talk about these things. He was not a man given to personal disclosure. But she listened with the attentive quality of someone who was genuinely interested, not in the story but in the person telling it, and that was very difficult to resist. One evening, about 10 days into his time in Dusk Creek, they were sitting on the hotel porch because the dining room had been taken over by a meeting of the local Cattlemen's Association, and the noise was considerable. The air was cooling, and the sky to the west was the extraordinary orange, and red that the high desert managed like an art form every single evening. And Sallie had her notebook open but was not writing in it, just sitting with it open on her knee and looking at the sky. "Do you intend to stay here?" he asked. "After all of this is settled," she considered the question. "I think so," she said. "The school here needs a teacher. The current one is planning to leave at the end of summer. The ranch needs to be properly managed again. Hatch is good, but he's been doing it alone for too long with not enough hands." She paused. "My life in Missouri was a good life, but it was also a life I fell into more than chose. This," She gestured vaguely at the sky, the town, the distance. This is something I'm choosing deliberately. He thought about what came after, about when this was resolved and the deed was secure and his job was done. He thought about riding away from Dust Creek in the way he had ridden away from everywhere else. The thought had a different quality than it usually did, an unpleasant quality, a catching feeling. "And you?" she asked, turning to look at him. "After this is over," he looked at the horizon. "I don't usually have an after," he said. "I have a next job." She was quiet, then thoughtfully, "That sounds lonely." He did not answer for a moment, then he said, "It has been." The admission surprised both of them. She turned back to the sky, and he watched her profile in the fading light and thought, with a clarity that had been building for days, that he was in a great deal of trouble. The complication that Arthur had been half expecting arrived in the form of a rider from Santa Fe on a Friday, 12 days after the letter to Price. The rider carried a document that was not good news, a report that someone had tampered with the land records at the territorial office, not destroyed them, but altered specific pages in the survey ledger from 1862. This was, Price wrote, significant because it meant the fraudulent competing claim now appeared to have corroboration from official records, which would make the legal fight considerably harder. Arthur read this with Sallie in the dining room and watched her work through the information with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She was not panicking, she was thinking. "Ezra Flood's testimony becomes even more critical," she said. "And we need the original surveyor's field notes if they still exist." Survey parties kept field notes separate from the official ledger records. If the notes show a different date or a different land description than what was altered in the ledger, it destroys the competing claim entirely. "Do you know where the field notes would be?" The surveyor's name was, according to Ezra, a man called Henderson. Price would know. "I need to write again." She was already reaching for her writing materials. But before the letter was sent, Marcus Lyle appeared again, this time not at the hotel but at the land office, where Sallie had gone to review the deed registry for the third time that week. Arthur was in the outer room when he heard the conversation sharpen in the next room, and he stood up. He did not go in. She had asked him not to intervene in these conversations, but he stood where he could see through the open doorway. Lyle was still smooth, but there was an edge under it now that had not been there before. He said that the legal complications would take months or years to resolve, that living in a hotel while fighting a territorial court battle was no way for a woman alone to live, that the sensible thing, the practical thing, was to accept a fair price for a property that was going to be a headache regardless. He said the word alone several times, not threateningly, just repeatedly. Sallie said, "I am not alone, Mr. Lyle. I have excellent legal counsel, the full documentation of my father's claim, and several witnesses to the history of this land. I also have a signed account from Ezra Flood that is on its way to Price in Santa Fe as we speak, which I mention purely for your information." Lyle's smoothness developed a small crack. He recovered it quickly. He said he hoped she would think carefully and that he wished her well, and he left. Sallie came out of the records room with her satchel and her chin up and the faint color in her cheeks that appeared when she had been very controlled for an extended period. Arthur looked at her. "He's worried," she said. "The Flood account rattled him. That means Flood's testimony is actually as damaging to the fraudulent claim as we thought." "He used the word alone 4 times, Arthur said. Her expression changed very slightly, became something more private. "I noticed. He was trying to make you feel it." "Yes. Did it work?" She met his eyes and said, very directly, "Less than it might have lately." He felt the specific effect of those words all the way down to the soles of his boots. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked away because he was a professional, and also because he was not sure what his face was doing and he did not want her to read it. They had crossed into new territory, quietly and without announcement, over the course of 2 weeks in a desert town where the sky was too big and the evenings too beautiful, and she was too perceptive and too brave and too entirely herself for him to maintain any sensible amount of immunity. He knew it. He suspected she knew it too. Neither of them said so directly, because they were both people who operated carefully and who understood that some things, once said aloud, changed everything and could not be unsaid. The letter to Price went that afternoon, and then came the waiting, which was its own particular test of character. In the days that followed, with the legal machinery moving slowly in Santa Fe, and the threat from Lyle still present but temporarily stalemated by the flood testimony, life in Dust Creek settled into a strange interlude that was partly tension and partly something else entirely. Sallie threw herself into the daily management of the ranch, which meant riding out every morning, reviewing accounts with Hatch, making decisions about the herd, beginning the process of hiring additional hands. She knew cattle. Arthur discovered this with a faint amazement watching her discuss pasture rotation and water management with Hatch in terms that were obviously informed by real knowledge, absorbed over years of summer visits and her father's letters. He rode with her every day. He helped where he could, mending a section of the northern fence line that had been damaged before the cut that started the boundary dispute, carrying supplies out from town, helping with a difficult foaling in the barn one night when Hatch's remaining hand was down with a stomach complaint. That night in the barn, with a lantern and the warm smell of hay and horses and the rain that had started outside, Sallie worked beside him for 3 hours bringing a new foal into the world. And by the end of it, they were both dirty and tired, and the foal was standing on uncertain legs in the lamplight. Sallie sat down in the clean hay with her back against the stall wall and looked at the foal with an expression of exhausted, uncomplicated joy that was the most unguarded he had ever seen her. Arthur sat down about 2 feet away, also looking at the foal, and the rain was coming down outside and the barn was warm and safe and quiet. "This is what my father loved," she said softly. "He wrote me letters about moments exactly like this. The foaling season, he called it the beginning of everything." Arthur said nothing because nothing needed saying. After a while she said, "I'm going to name her for him. James is not a name for a mare, obviously, but his mother's name was Clara." "Clara Bancroft." "That's a good name," Arthur said. She turned her head and looked at him. They were close in the small space, the lantern between them casting warm light. Her hair had come down from its pins over the course of the night's work and lay loose around her shoulders, and Arthur thought with absolute helpless clarity that she was the most remarkable woman he had ever known and that he was entirely and completely done pretending that he was not in love with her. He did not say this. He looked at the foal. "Arthur," she said, "yes, I need to tell you something." He waited. "When Dunmore hired you, what exactly did he pay you?" He named a figure. She nodded slowly. "I have more than that in the ranch account that I've already cleared with Price to access," she said. "If you are willing to work for the ranch instead of the railroad, I would pay you that figure. For the same work, protecting the land and helping me manage it while the legal situation is resolved." He looked at her. She was looking at him very directly, the way she always did, with nothing hidden in it, but there was something underneath the directness that was careful and vulnerable in a way he had not seen from her before. "I would need to return Dunmore's money," he said. "The portion for work already done." "That seems correct," she said. "And I'd need to tell him clearly that I'm no longer in his employ." "Yes." He looked at the foal. He thought about the next job that he did not have yet and the road that had no particular destination on it. He thought about a woman who had come from Missouri to defend her father's name and had not wavered once despite every pressure brought against her. "That's agreeable," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that carried weight. "Good," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. He returned Dunmore's money 2 days later, riding to the railroad man's office at the survey camp 3 miles out of town, sitting down across from a desk, and laying the money on it. Dunmore was surprised, then not surprised, then professionally resigned about it. "She got to you," he said, not unkindly. "The situation is what it is," Arthur said. "Her deed is valid. The competing claim is fraudulent. You know that as well as I do." Dunmore leaned back in his chair. He was not, Arthur thought, a bad man. He was a man with investors and schedules and bosses of his own. "The easement," he said. "You'll need to negotiate that fairly," Arthur said. "You might be surprised. She's not unreasonable, but she won't be pressured. Treat her the way you'd treat a cattle baron with 10,000 acres and a lawyer from Chicago, and you'll get further." Dunmore was quiet for a moment. "You're fond of her," he said. Arthur stood up and picked up his hat. "Good afternoon, Mr. Dunmore." On the ride back into town, with the late afternoon heat pressing down and the red rocks burning in the western light, Arthur felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 2 weeks. He had, he supposed, just made a decision. Not just the professional one, though that was real and clear, and he did not regret it for a second. He had made a decision about the other thing, the feeling he had been refusing to name, and the decision was simply that he was going to stop pretending it did not exist. He was not going to do anything immediate or reckless about it. That was not who he was. But he was going to stop fighting it as if it were a problem, because it had long since stopped feeling like one. He found Sallie at the hotel in the dining room, writing at the table where they took all their meals, and he sat down across from her and told her about the conversation with Dunmore. She listened. Then she said, "And the easement discussion. I told him to come to you directly, fairly, as a business proposition, without the pressure." She was quiet for a moment. "If the right-of-way actually serves the valley, if it brings goods and people and connects us to Las Cruces and beyond, an easement might not be unreasonable. On the right terms." She looked up from her papers. "Terms that I negotiate with full knowledge of what I'm signing. That's what I told him to expect." She looked at him, and something warm and private moved through her expression. "Thank you," she said, "for the honest conversation with him, for coming back." He met her eyes. "There wasn't really anywhere else I needed to be," he said, and let it sit there between them plainly, meaning exactly as much as it meant. The color in her cheeks changed very slightly. She looked down at her papers. But she was not, he noticed, writing anything. The reply from Price in Santa Fe arrived 11 days later, at the end of August in 1882, when the heat had broken slightly, and the evenings had begun to carry the first suggestion that autumn was somewhere on its way. The letter was long and detailed, and in its essential conclusion, very good news. Price had located the Henderson survey field notes. They were in the possession of Henderson's family in Albuquerque, the old surveyor having died in 1875, but his daughter having kept his professional records with careful preservation. The field notes showed clearly that the 1862 survey of the Bancroft land had been a clean first survey of unclaimed land, with no prior claim in the notes, and a land description that did not match the fraudulent competing claim in any particular. When combined with Ezra Flood's signed testimony, Price believed the competing claim would be dismissed by the territorial court without going to full hearing. He also noted, in the last paragraph, that the alteration of the official ledger was being referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office, and that preliminary investigation had traced the alteration to a man in the land office's employ who had a documented financial relationship with Marcus Lyle's land company. Sallie read this letter standing in the hotel lobby where the mail had just been delivered, and Arthur watched her read it, and he watched the moment when she reached the last paragraph and understood what it fully meant. Her composure remained, as it always did, but her eyes were bright and she breathed out long and slow. She looked up at him. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she agreed. She looked back at the letter and then up again, and then, with the particular decision of someone who has been disciplined for a very long time and has chosen this specific moment to set it down, she crossed the 2 steps between them and put her arms around him. He held her. He did not think about it or plan it or consider it. He simply held her, and she held on to him, and the hotel lobby with its few other occupants and its afternoon sounds around them fell away into complete irrelevance. When she pulled back, there were no tears, because she was Sallie Bancroft and she did not do that in hotel lobbies, but her eyes were bright with something that was partly relief and partly something else. Something that had been building for 2 weeks of mornings riding out to the ranch and evenings on the porch and one long night in a barn watching a foal learn to stand. She looked up at him. He was looking down at her. There was very little distance between them. "I need to write to Price immediately," she said, but she did not move. "Yes," he said, but neither did he. "And tomorrow I should ride out and tell Hatch." "That's right, Arthur," she said. "Yes. Are you going to keep standing here looking at me, or are you going to say what you have been very carefully not saying for 2 weeks?" He considered the question with the complete seriousness it deserved. Then he said, "I am not supposed to have fallen in love with you, for a great many professional and practical reasons that I told myself very thoroughly and at considerable length." She looked at him. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. "You made it entirely impossible not to." She smiled. It was the full, genuine smile, the rare one that came from the place she did not usually let people see, and it was better than the high desert sunset and the rain in the barn and every other beautiful thing he had seen in the past 2 weeks combined. "I tried," she said, "to make it easy for you. I told myself it was simply professional warmth. Did you believe it?" "Not after the 4th day," she admitted. He laughed, which was something he did rarely enough that the sound surprised him slightly. She laughed too, and then they were both standing in the Dusk Creek Hotel lobby laughing about the fact that they had spent 2 weeks being careful and professional, and very, very obvious to everyone probably except themselves. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, which was a small, careful, deliberate gesture, and she did not move away from it. "May I court you properly?" he asked. "Or in whatever form properly means in Dusk Creek, New Mexico Territory in 1882. "You have been courting me properly for 2 weeks," she said, "whether either of us called it that." "Then let me do it with intent," he said. "Acknowledged." She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at everything, directly and without flinching. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He held out his arm, which she took, and they walked into the dining room to have their supper at their usual table by the wall, and everything was exactly the same and entirely different. The weeks that followed were the happiest Arthur could remember. Not recklessly happy, not the kind of happiness that ignores difficulty, but the solid, real, grounded kind that comes from doing meaningful work alongside someone you love, with everything clear between you. Marcus Lyle's land clerk was taken into custody by the territorial marshal's office in the first week of September. Lyle himself was not charged, the evidence of his direct involvement in the deed fraud being circumstantial, but the investigation cast a long enough shadow over him that his legal pressure on the Bancroft land evaporated. He sent no more men. He made no more appearances at the hotel. He became, simply, a neighbor with whom one maintained a cold but correct distance. Sallie's deed was confirmed clean and uncontested at the Territorial Land Office in the second week of September. Price wrote a very satisfied letter. Ezra Flood had a celebratory drink on the house at the better of the two saloons. Caleb Hatch, when Sallie rode out to tell him, said nothing for a long moment and then took off his hat and held it in both hands and said, very quietly, "Your father would be proud of you, Miss Bancroft." She had kept it together for everything. She did not keep it together for that. She turned away toward the corral and stood there for a moment while Arthur stood at a respectful distance, and Hatch found something important to look at in the other direction. When she turned back, her eyes were red at the edges and her chin was up, and she said, "I want to start rebuilding the eastern fence properly. We'll need additional wire and posts from the dry goods store." "Yes, ma'am," said Hatch. Arthur helped her back onto her horse and held her stirrup for a moment, and she looked down at him and put her hand briefly over his, and then they rode back toward town in the long, gold afternoon. In the third week of September, Horace Dunmore came to see Sallie at the hotel for a meeting that Arthur did not attend, but which Sallie recounted to him afterward with the dry precision that meant she had enjoyed it. Dunmore had made a straightforward business proposal for a railroad easement along the southern boundary of the Bancroft land, following a route that was several hundred yards from the water source, and crossed only rocky ground with no agricultural value. He had offered a proper negotiated price for the easement, annual maintenance compensation, and a guarantee that the nearest depot would be established at Dust Creek, which would benefit the entire valley economy. Sallie had counterproposed a slightly larger annual payment, a clause requiring the railroad to hire locally for track maintenance, and a stipulation that the easement would revert to the land if the rail line was abandoned. Dunmore had agreed to all of it. Sallie had said she would have her attorney in Santa Fe review the document before signing. And, Arthur asked, and Price reviewed it, and it was perfectly acceptable, and I signed it yesterday afternoon. She was sitting across from him at supper with the faint, satisfied expression of someone who had completed a significant piece of work. The railroad gets their right-of-way. We get a fair price and a depot, which means the ranch will have access to markets it has never had before. Hatch is already talking about increasing the herd. Your father would have made the same deal, Arthur said. She looked at him and her expression shifted into something quieter. Yes, she said, I think he would have. They were quiet for a moment, comfortable in the way of people who had found their rhythm with each other. There is something I want to say, Arthur said. She looked at him. He had thought about how to say this for several days because he was not a man who spoke easily about interior things and he wanted to do it properly. He said, I came here for a job I should have thought harder about before I took it. I was working for people who were not working in your interest, and I knew it, and I took the money anyway, and that's not something I'm proud of. What I want you to know is that it stopped being about the job very quickly, and that everything I have done since that first morning has been because I wanted to, not because anyone was paying me. She looked at him for a long moment. The dining room was quiet around them, the late supper hour having thinned the crowd. I know that, she said. I knew it before you did, possibly. Probably, he agreed, which made her smile. Arthur, she said, and leaned forward slightly across the table. I came here to do one thing, which was to hold what my father built, and I have done that. And somewhere in the process of doing it, something else happened that I did not plan for, and that has become more important to me than I have the right words for. She paused. You are honest. You say what you mean. You let me be exactly who I am without trying to manage it or soften it or talk over it. Do you have any idea how rare that is? He thought of the way she had said her father was a quiet man, straightforward, who always said what he meant. He felt the weight of the comparison and its tenderness. I love you, he said, plainly and simply, because he was a man who said what he meant. She looked at him with those direct green eyes in the lamplight of the dining room. I love you too, she said, with the same plainness, as if it were simply a fact they were confirming between them, which it was. They sat there for a moment in the quiet of that acknowledgement. Then she said, Are you going to ask me something? I'm working up to it at an appropriate pace, he said. Take your time, she said, smiling, and did not look in any hurry at all. October arrived and brought a change of color to the desert hills, the scrub oak turning bronze and red along the ridgelines, the cottonwoods at the creek going gold. The ranch was well underway. Sallie had hired 2 additional ranch hands, both men Hatch had vouched for, and a woman named Mee Dunning from town who came out 3 days a week to help with the practical running of the house. The cattle were in good condition, and the water situation was secure, and the fence was repaired. Sallie had also applied for the schoolteacher position at the Dust Creek School, which she had mentioned in the first week, and been accepted. She was due to start the new term in January, which was when the current teacher left for Tucson. Until then, she was preparing materials and getting to know the families in town, building the community knowledge she had started on that first day when she talked to the woman in the dry goods store. Arthur had, without either of them exactly making a formal arrangement about it, become a permanent feature of the ranch operation. He rode out with Sallie most mornings and helped with whatever needed doing. He was good with horses, with fences, with the 100 small physical tasks that a working ranch required. He had also, at Sallie's quiet suggestion, spoken to the town marshal about deputy work, which the marshal, a decent man named Alvara, had accepted with visible relief given that Dust Creek was growing, and he was one man covering a great deal of territory. So Arthur Garrett had, by the end of October 1882, without entirely planning it, built a life. He stood on the porch of the Bancroft ranch house one evening in the last week of October, watching the sunset, and thought about the person he had been riding into Dust Creek in August, who had expected a simple job and a quick departure, and had been so certain he knew how to keep himself at professional distance from everything. He heard the door open behind him, and then Sallie was standing beside him, close enough that their arms touched, which was now a familiar and deeply comfortable thing. "Beautiful evening," she said. "Yes. Hatch says the north pasture needs its water trough repaired before the real cold comes. I'll do it tomorrow morning." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had started doing in the evenings when they sat on the porch, and he put his arm around her. "I've been thinking," she said. "That's rarely a quiet occupation with you," he said. "Don't be unkind," but she was smiling. "I've been thinking about the future of the ranch, about what it can be with the rail access. Hatch thinks we could double the herd in 2 years, and the school will be good, I think. The community here is real. This is a real place." He listened. "I want to stay," she said. "I know I said that before, but I mean it in a different sense now. Not just me staying, I mean all of it." She lifted her head and looked at him. "I want the whole future here. I want everything that comes with that." He looked at her in the evening light, this woman who had stood outside a land office on the day he arrived, and argued 2 large men into retreat with nothing but documentation and spine, who had held a horse's head in a barn corral while he wrapped a wound, who had laughed in a hotel lobby, and said 4 days as if it were the most honest thing in the world. He reached into the pocket of his coat. He had been carrying the thing in that pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment, which he supposed was never a calculable thing and perhaps was simply the moment you decided it was. It was a ring. He had ordered it from the jeweler in Las Cruces, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, which was both beautiful and practical and entirely suited to the woman in front of him. He held it in his hand, and she looked at it, and then at him with an expression that was very still and very bright at the same time. "I rode into this town with the intention of spending a few weeks, collecting my wages and moving on," he said. "I had a long-established habit of moving on. It has served me well in some respects and been very lonely in others." He held her gaze. "I do not want to move on from this. I do not want to move on from you. I would like, with your agreement, to be here for every fence that needs mending and every foal that needs seeing into the world, and every morning riding out and every evening watching the sun go down over these particular hills." He paused. "Sallie Bancroft, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment in the way she looked at things she was deciding, directly and without flinching, and with everything she had brought to every other decision in her life. "Yes," she said. Clear and simple and entirely certain. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it on her hand, at the turquoise catching the last of the sunset light, and then she looked at him, and the full, rare, genuine smile was there, the one from the place she did not usually let people see. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the desert evening came down around them warm and quiet with the stars beginning to appear over the ridge. They were married in November, 3.5 months after Arthur Garrett had ridden into Dust Creek with a job he had not wanted, and a conscience that had not let him ignore what was right. The ceremony was held at the small church on the east end of the main street, which was a plain adobe building with rough wooden pews and a minister named Reverend Hartley, who had a genuine warmth about him that made the service feel like more than a formality. Sallie wore a dress of deep blue wool, which was practical and beautiful in the way she was practical and beautiful, and her hair was down, as he had always thought it preferred to be. Arthur wore his good coat and a new shirt purchased at the dry goods store, and Hatch stood beside him as his witness, with the gruff sentimentality of a man who was trying very hard not to show it. Ezra Flood attended and sat in the front pew and wept openly and seemed entirely comfortable with this. Me Dunning had organized a celebration at the ranch afterward, a genuine feast by Dust Creek standards, with several of the neighboring families in attendance. The two ranch hands played a fiddle and a harmonica. Hatch danced, which was something that apparently happened once every several years and was attended by general amazement. Arthur danced with Sallie and she laughed when he missed a step, and he said he had never claimed to be a dancer, and she said she would teach him, and he thought that was a very good reason to keep dancing. The evening ended with the fire burning down and the guests making their way home in the cool November dark, and the ranch quiet around them, and Arthur and Sallie standing in the main room of the house that had been her father's with the lamplight going soft. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Being home." She looked around the room, at the fire, at the walls that held the history of a man who had come here with nothing and built something real. "Like it fits," she said. "Like a thing that was always supposed to be this way and has finally arrived at it." He took her hand and she leaned into him, and the ranch was quiet around them with the sounds of the high desert night outside. The first winter at the ranch was clear and cold with occasional snow that turned the red hills white and made the mornings extraordinary. Sallie started her school term in January, riding into town on the days she taught, and coming home in the late afternoon with a dozen stories about her students, which she told over supper with the same warmth she always had when talking about children who were learning things. There was a boy named Samuel, she told Arthur, who was 8 years old and had never been to school before and was so hungry for it that he stayed after every day asking questions, until she finally had to gently explain that she needed to ride home before dark. "He reminds me of the boy in Missouri," Arthur said. "Thomas." "Yes," she said, pleased that he had remembered. "Very much like Thomas." Arthur's work with Deputy Marshal Alvaro was steady and mostly unexciting, which was exactly as he preferred it. Dust Creek's growth brought the usual assortment of minor disputes and occasional drunken fracases, none of it requiring anything extreme, and the presence of someone with Arthur's particular capability tended to prevent situations from escalating to the point where they needed to be resolved any more forcefully than a look and a quiet word. In the spring, Sallie told him she was expecting a child, and she told him over breakfast in the kitchen of the ranch house with the morning sun coming in and the smell of coffee and new bread. And her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something that was joy and something that was also a very private kind of fear, the vulnerability of wanting something this much. He crossed the kitchen and held her for a long time without saying anything, because that was what the moment needed, and she held on, and when they finally separated she was laughing a little and so was he. In late October, 18 months after Arthur had first ridden into Dust Creek, their son was born in the bedroom of the Bancroft ranch house. He came into the world loudly and with considerable opinion about the process, which Arthur thought was entirely appropriate. The doctor from town attended. Hatch paced in the yard until Arthur came out and told him it was done, and both mother and son were well, at which point Hatch went into the barn and stayed there for 20 minutes for reasons he never explained. They named the boy James, after Sallie's father, James Bancroft Garrett, which was a name that carried everything it was supposed to carry. He was a large, strong, dark-haired baby with eyes that could not yet decide their color, and a disposition that swung between profound contentment and fierce announcement, with very little in between. Sallie held him in the lamplight of the bedroom and looked at him with an expression that Arthur thought he would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. She looked at the baby and then at Arthur and said, "James." "Hello, James." The baby looked at her with the vague but profound attention of the very new, and Arthur sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around both of them. "Your father would have been very pleased," he said quietly. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "He would have liked you," she said, "very much. He would have said you are a straightforward man, and he meant that as the highest possible compliment. Then I'll work to deserve it, Arthur said. The years at the ranch settled into themselves with the natural rhythm of a life that was genuinely lived. Young James grew from a baby into a boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's steady disposition. A child who was drawn to horses from the time he could toddle, and who followed Hatch around the ranch like a shadow from the time he could walk steadily enough to do so. Hatch, who had not shown any particular softness in 20 years of working ranches, became visibly and helplessly fond of the boy, and everyone pretended not to notice. Samuel, Sally's student from that first January term, had become by the age of 10 a reader of voracious habit who had worked through every book Sallie had brought from Missouri, and was starting on the one she ordered from the catalog in Santa Fe. She told Arthur one evening that she thought Samuel had the mind for university, that it would be a genuine waste if the boy did not have the opportunity for more education than Dust Creek could provide, and the way she said it was the way she said everything that mattered to her, with a quiet, direct intensity. "Then we'll find a way to make the opportunity available," Arthur said. She looked at him. If the means to help exists and can be managed, it should be. That's all." She smiled, and it was the full one, the real one. "You have become a very good man," she said, "to have living in this particular valley." "I was motivated by favorable circumstances," he said. She laughed and leaned across the table and kissed him, which was the kind of thing that still made him feel exactly what it had made him feel that first time, which was, he supposed, how it was supposed to work when you had married the right person. 3 years after James was born, they had a second child, a girl they named Clara, for the foal that had been born that rainy night in the barn and for Sally's grandmother, and because the name was simply right. Clara came out of the world with a particular determination that was very clearly inherited from her mother, and a delight in noise that was entirely her own. By the spring of 1886, the Bancroft Ranch, which Arthur had taken to calling by both names in his own thinking, the Bancroft Garrett place, was a genuinely thriving operation. Hatch was still the foreman, older now, and with a mustache gone entirely white, but with the same precise competence and the same gruff dignity. The herd was what Hatch had predicted, larger than James Bancroft had ever managed alone, with access to the Las Cruces market via the railroad line that ran along the southern boundary on the easement that Sallie had negotiated fairly and firmly, and with full knowledge of what she was signing. The school had grown. Dust Creek itself had grown past its original character into something more settled and permanent, with new families and new businesses and a second church, and a proper reading room attached to the library that Sallie had organized with 3 other women from the community. The reading room had been her project for 2 years, and the completion of it was something she was quietly proud of in the way she was proud of all her best accomplishments, without fanfare, simply as a fact of what had been built. Arthur walked through it with her on the evening before it officially opened, when it was empty and smelled of new wood and fresh paint, and the particular clean smell of new books. She walked along the shelves, running her hand lightly over the spines, and he watched her do it with the feeling that he had learned to simply allow and not fight, the feeling of profound, complete rightness, of being exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly this person, in this particular life that had been entirely unexpected and entirely his own. "What are you thinking?" she asked, without turning around. "I'm thinking about the morning I rode into this town," he said. "About everything I expected it to be and everything it turned out to be instead." She turned then and looked at him. 4 years of marriage and the beginning years of this life, and the gray that was beginning at his temples and the laugh lines that were beginning at the corners of her eyes, and neither of them any different in the ways that mattered from the 2 people who had stood in a hotel lobby holding a letter and admitted that they were in love. "Was it terrible?" she asked, with the slight smile that meant she was teasing him. "All the unexpected things." "Some of the worst of my life," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "And the best," he said, "by a considerable margin." She crossed the reading room and stood in front of him, and he looked down at her and she looked up at him, and the evening light came through the new windows of the room she had built for a town she had chosen to make her home. "You know," she said, "you were not supposed to fall in love with me." "No," he agreed, "I was not. You were supposed to be professional and uninvested and move on to the next job when this one was done. That was the plan. What happened to the plan?" He put his hands on her face and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the warmth of someone who was entirely where she wanted to be, and the new books waited on their shelves in the quiet of the reading room. When he pulled back, he said, "You happened to the plan. You were not supposed to make it so difficult not to." She smiled, the full one, the real one, the one she had been giving him for 4 years now, and that still felt like a privilege every time. "I wasn't trying to," she said. "I know," he said. "That made it worse." She laughed and took his hand, and they walked out into the Dust Creek evening together, into the life they had built out of a bad job and a fraudulent deed claim, and 2 weeks of professional distance that had not lasted 5 minutes past the moment she had described her father as a good man who always said what he meant. The cottonwoods along the creek were full and green in the spring evening. The ranch was 7 miles south, with their children asleep in the house their grandfather had built. Hatch was in the bunkhouse playing cards with the hands. Little James had graduated, his mother had decided, from foal watching to actual horse care, and had taken his responsibilities with the seriousness of a small person who understood that things depended on him. Clara had discovered at the age of 2 that she had opinions about everything and intended to express them, which was something everyone at the ranch had simply accepted as the nature of Clara. In the town behind them, Ezra Flood was still at the livery, older but still sharp, still remembering everything. Alvara was still the marshal, with Arthur still deputy, and the town was growing into itself with the particular energy of a place that had decided to become real. Samuel, Sally's student, had been accepted to study at the university in Albuquerque, which Sallie had quietly helped arrange by writing letters to people who could influence such things, and which she had presented to the boy's family not as charity, but as a recognition of something that was plainly true, that the boy had a mind worth educating properly, and it would be a waste not to. Marcus Lyle was still in the valley, but had become, as Sallie had predicted, simply a neighbor at a cool distance, someone you acknowledged on the street and had no particular warmth for and did no business with. The man who had tampered with the land records had been tried and convicted in territorial court, which had been a small but satisfying piece of justice. Arthur and Sallie walked along the main street of Dust Creek in the spring evening of 1886, 4 years married, 2 children in the world, a ranch and a school and a reading room between them as evidence of a life lived with intent, and the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had nothing left to prove to each other and everything still left to say. At the edge of town, where the road turned south toward the ranch, Sallie stopped and turned and looked back at the town, the way she sometimes did, taking its measure, noting its growth. "It's a good town," she said. "It is," Arthur agreed. "My father chose well coming here. He did." She looked up at the first stars coming out over the eastern ridge, and he stood beside her in the cooling air, and the town settled into its evening around them, and the road south led to the house with their children in it, and the horses in the corral, and the creek in the cottonwoods, and the particular piece of the high desert that was theirs by deed and by work and by love. "We should get back," she said. "Me said James was fighting sleep at supper." "He's your son," Arthur said. "He fights everything." "He's your son," she countered. "He wins everything he fights." They looked at each other in the growing dark and both smiled. He offered his arm, she took it. They walked south down the road toward home, toward the life that had been entirely unplanned and entirely right, toward the children and the ranch and the years still ahead of them, toward everything that had come from one morning in August of 1882, when a man had ridden into a town with a job he did not want and found, outside a land office in the dust and the heat, the woman who would make every plan he had completely irrelevant. He had not been supposed to fall for her. She had not made it remotely possible not to. And the life they had built from that collision of accident and stubborn integrity and growing love was as solid and real and enduring as the red rock hills that watched over the valley through every season, through drought and rain, and the long golden spans of high desert days, holding its ground the way a good thing does, simply by being what it is and refusing to be anything less.